Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Del, and thank you all for listening. And if you listened carefully, you've noticed our new theme song. We're delighted to have this song with the kind permission from Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm. I'm in sunny San Francisco at our board meeting where we're all busily getting ready for our Chain Reaction Gala tonight. We're going to present highlights of that gala and the speakers there in future podcasts. And we want to congratulate the winners of the pairs of $250 tickets to this gala for those who emailed in, the first responders from our promo at last week's podcast. This week, I'm delighted to sit down with my friend and colleague, former National Football League wide receiver Donté Stallworth, who, as you'll hear, is a national security wonk. He's got a lot to say. Before we get to Donté, here's the news you need to know. The clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm with Mary Kaszynski, our Deputy Policy Director, and John Carl Baker, our Senior Program Officer. We got a lot to talk about, so we're going to get started, Mary, with this developing scandal in the State Department using American taxpayer money to criticize and intimidate critics of the administration's Iran policy. What's going on?
This really is an outrageous scandal. So what happened is the State Department funded a project called Iran Disinfo. In theory, this project was intended to counter propaganda put out by the Iranian regime. What in fact happened was this group, Iran Disinfo, started attacking American citizens who were working to promote engagement with Iran, promote human rights in Iran, study the impact of sanctions on Iranian citizens. The group Iran Disinfo has a Twitter account that they were using to attack Iranian Americans, journalists, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch.
I got attacked by them myself.
It's really outrageous. And, again, these were American taxpayer dollars.
Give me an example of who was attacked.
I think the particularly outrageous one is Jason Rezaian, a Washington Post journalist who was jailed in Iran for over a year. The Twitter account Iran Disinfo attacked Jason for some of his views on promoting engagement and understanding human rights in Iran.
So first he was attacked by the Iranian government, and now he's being attacked by the American government.
Exactly.
Wow.
With his own money, with American taxpayer dollars.
Right, he's paying for the attacks on him.
Exactly.
Great. So what can we do about this? What's being done?
Well, what's really cool is that House Democrats are stepping up and demanding an investigation and have requested information, a briefing from the State Department regarding how these funds were so inappropriately used. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Engel is requesting this investigation, requesting more information and more transparency about what could possibly have happened for American taxpayer dollars to be used to attack American citizens.
And are they still doing the attacks? Are the attacks continuing?
This funding has been cut, so the State Department cut this grant that they gave to Iran Disinfo, but the Twitter account is still active. It appears that the attacks have ceased for now, but the program is still going. And,
right.
Again, it's really unclear what happened here and if it could happen again.
And anyone who's been subject to these kinds of attacks, and what happens is there's a tweet which is like a signal flare that goes up, and then there's these trolls that come out to attack you, swarm your Twitter account, and these automated, what they call bots, right? Automated accounts that are coming out attacking you, pretending to be real people, but they're just automated attack machines. This is outrageous. Mary, stay on this. We're going to keep following this. But we want to go to John Carl now to talk about the administration's nuclear policy and what might be guiding it.
Just recently, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency made a big splash when he claimed that Russia probably, quote unquote, is conducting extremely low-yield nuclear tests in violation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. This is huge news already, and it would be a major event if there was evidence for it. But of course, he didn't actually cite any. But among people
and later backtrack to say, well, they had the capability to do these tests. Like you have the capability to kill somebody doesn't mean you're actually going to do it.
That's true. I mean, probably not.
Not today. Okay.
Yeah, not right now. But this caused a lot of alarm because the administration has a pretty interesting track record of raising often quite dubious violations of treaties, sometimes completely false ones, as reasons to get out of them. And the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is a major landmark treaty, something that has essentially stopped nuclear testing with the exception of North Korea. And if it were to go away, if the U.S. was to remove itself, we have never ratified it, but we did sign it, this could cause ramifications throughout the nuclear powers, and nuclear testing could begin again.
Right, there's countries like India and Pakistan would start popping them off right away.
Exactly.
China would start testing again.
Yes. And it got me thinking, back when Trump first got into office, the Heritage Foundation released a series of recommendations for the Trump administration's nuclear weapons policy. So I went and I pulled it up again, and it's stunning how many of them have already been enacted.
Like?
There are things like stop nuclear weapons reductions, and in fact, they want the production of more nuclear weapons, new nuclear weapons, warheads, which the Trump administration is engaging in, its new low-yield warhead. They want to withdraw from New START, which is something that many of us suspect the administration actually does want to do. They wanted withdrawal from the INF Treaty, which the administration has already said it will do.
The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Ronald Reagan negotiated.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can go down the list and just see that so many of these recommendations have already been enacted. And at the end of the list, one of the last ones, is that they say they want to respect the Senate regarding the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which sounds all right. But what it's really about is laying the groundwork for a potential withdrawal. And just this week, a guy who works at the Heritage Foundation, a guy named Ted Drummond, wrote an article where he said that the potential for withdrawal should be considered.
Right, respect. So what happened was the administration signed it, Bill Clinton signed it, negotiated, put it before the Senate. The Senate did not approve it, but it stays on the table, as they say. So it's before the Senate still and could be brought up again for ratification should a president want to do it. What they're talking about is respecting the Senate. They want the administration to pull it back, to pull it off the table, or to unsign the CTBT. So we have to watch for this. This would be devastating news. Another destruction of the nuclear safety net.
Yes.
Thank you very much, John Carl. Mary, one more thing before we go.
I have a very exciting update. Ploughshares, along with our partners at Win Without War, Beyond the Bomb, and Daily Kos, and many other groups, have launched a new petition calling on presidential candidates to oppose the first use of nuclear weapons. We're really excited about this initiative. It's outrageous that President Trump, or really any president, has the power to launch a nuclear war anytime they want. You can learn more about our petition. Again, it was just launched, and we would love to have your support. The petition is available on our Ploughshares website at ploughshares.org/nofirstuse.
It's spelled the English way, Plough. Thank you, Mary, for getting that in because we are out of time. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, John Carl, for your updates today. I am delighted to be sitting in our offices here and talking to Donté Stallworth. He and I have been friends for a long time now. We met on Twitter. That's right. That's how we met?
Yeah, we met on Twitter.
Just corresponding.
Actually met you first, but...
What do you mean?
I saw you in Countdown to Zero, and then I started to stalk you slightly on Twitter. I'm like, hey, this guy's kind of cool, and he knows his stuff. And I started following you on Twitter, and you tweeted a number of good articles and good perspectives, and I appreciated that, so I started following you.
Well, our friendship might be the best thing that's come out of Twitter for me. So,
appreciate that.
So that's great. Donté is a political journalist now and a former wide receiver who played for 10 years in the National Football League, beginning with the New Orleans Saints, but then also with the Philadelphia Eagles, the New England Patriots, Washington, D.C.'s football team. Yep. In fact, I think one of the great pleasures is watching the video of your last catch. Tell me if I'm right about this.
Yeah.
Your last catch was, I think, a 63-yard touchdown catch from the New England Patriots quarterback, Tom Brady.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was an incredible play. You have incredible moves.
Thanks.
So for those of you could stop listening to the podcast and just Google Donté Stallworth, Tom Brady, touchdown catch, and you'll see what I mean. But after retiring from football, Donté was hired as a fellow by the Huffington Post. He was also worked briefly at Center for American Progress, and he has covered and wrote about a wide range of national security issues. He's also worked since then for Valens Global, a consulting firm focusing on violent non-state actors as a strategic development consultant. And you'll often see Donté pop up on not just the NFL network often, but also on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. So thank you for joining us, Donté.
Appreciate you. I'm excited to be here.
That's great.
It's an honor.
So let's get started broad. The overall picture. What worries you about our strategic situation at the moment? What worries you about where the world is going?
What doesn't worry me is probably an easier answer and a shorter answer. I traveled. I was blessed to travel last summer to majority Europe countries, but I spent a little time in Casablanca in Croatia, and the typical response that I got from most people there, knowing that I was American, they love Americans. People love Americans everywhere I've been, but they also understand that our government is. They're able to separate the people from the government, which is great, because I felt like when I was over there, I was on an apology tour, and everyone that I bumped into in different countries, I was saying, "Hey, I'm not a Trump supporter. I apologize for what's happening." And people around the world are pretty intelligent. I would say they understand politics just as much as Americans do, American politics specifically. And what worries me is that not only is it that the president, the current president, and the current administration, the paths that they are taking us down are paths that we've seen before in history. And I think it's extremely important for everyone to pay attention and to understand the path that we're on. There's a great Chinese proverb, I'm probably going to butcher it, but it says something to the effect of if you continue on the path that you're on, you're going to end up at the destination that you're seeking. Something to that effect. I know I totally butchered it, but I think it applies to the current administration and really the current political landscape in America, where we have children, hundreds of children that are being separated from families at the border, that are, as we saw a report I think on NBC recently, where kids are being held overnight in vans.
Or sleeping on concrete floors at the detention centers.
A number of these things that...
And this is America.
Yeah, and we don't expect that, right? Especially as Americans, we kind of take pride in our liberal democracy and FDR's Atlantic Charter and things of that nature. We tend to see ourselves as a global force for good, and yet throughout time in the history of our country, that has not always been the case. And so I think the ugly part of our history is beginning to rear its head through this administration. And these are the old sentiments, the fear of immigrants, the xenophobia, the racism, the militarism. It's I don't want to say it's all beginning to pop back up, but it's becoming full force. And they've been able, the GOP, the Republicans have been able to kind of mask this thing for a while, but Trump has taken off the mask.
Yes.
Trump has said and done all the things that the Republicans have wanted for years, but just haven't been able to come out and articulate in a way that doesn't sound abhorrent as the way Trump does. And they can just write it off and say, oh, that's the way the president speaks, but yet they're continuing to vote and continuing to back these policies.
So when you see this on national security issues, what worries you there?
There's a lot, Joe. I think the relationship right now with Iran is probably tops as far as one of the most important issues that are happening right now. We had a nuclear deal done. The JCPOA was done with 6 or 7 nations total.
Yeah.
Although the opponents of this deal will say it was an Obama deal. And of course, the United States led in this, but it was also China. It was also Russia. It was also the UK. It was also Germany. It was also France.
The European Union, all
you know?
our allies supported this deal
This
with
is
a
what you
couple
want.
of exceptions.
This is what you want. You don't want unilateral movements, right?
Yeah.
And Trump has now just dismantled this, and now he wants to do a deal. So it was obviously clear from the beginning. Well, yeah, he says, this is right. He says he wants to do a deal. So basically it's like you rip up the old deal because it has Obama's prints on it, and then you want to come and have a better deal, which is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. The Iranians are not going to sit down and go through another deal that was a good deal for both sides, for all involved, not just for America and Iran, but for the world. No one wants a nuclear Iran. No one wants anyone to have nuclear weapons, or at least I don't. I know obviously you don't, Joe, which is how I began following you. But yet and still here we are at a point where we're back to the crucible where it's going to be either war with Iran or a deal, and we've already had a deal in place. And so you have guys like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, especially John Bolton, who I don't, in a normal society, in a normal country, he would not be allowed to be in government anymore. I mean, he's bragged about the Iraq War still to this day being the right decision.
Yes.
He's bragged about, he wrote an op-ed in New York Times, I think in 2015, that was headlined to stop Iran's bomb Iran. And he's advocated to bomb Iran over the years. And so with him being national security advisor, that puts us in a more dangerous position than we were during the deal and immediately after the deal.
But let's not let Mike Pompeo off the hook.
Oh,
You
no.
and I were talking just before about this disturbing development that has just come out in the last couple of weeks about the State Department funding an organization, an enterprise called, what is it, Iran Disinformation.
Iran Disinformation, yeah.
Allegedly to counter disinformation being spread by foreign governments that we oppose, Iran, Russia, China, etc. But it turns out to be used to target and smear and try to silence critics in the United States of the administration's Iran policy.
Yeah, American citizens as well, and which is, that's creepy. It's we have to kind of recalibrate in the digital age, in the technological age, what this means. It on the surface, it may not seem like a big deal. It's just you could write it off as, oh, it's just Twitter and people are having conversations. But this is a State Department funded entity that has been trolling American citizens and attacking American citizens, not physically, but verbally, and attacking them, smearing them through the internet, that have been advocating essentially for a peaceful resolution between the United States and Iran, and been advocating for the nuclear deal, as many Americans did. And here we are with Mike Pompeo as the head of the State Department, and it's just another blip on the radar, and it's extremely important that we pay attention to these little blips and not get distracted so much by Trump's tweets or the idiocy, the everyday idiocy of his Twitter feed, of his comments and his quotes, because there are extremely important things that are happening that are getting pushed to the wayside and not focusing so much on Trump and his administration.
Right, I was
what they're
attacked
really
by these guys.
Yeah.
Do you get hit by this? Do you get hit by these kinds of attacks?
You know what? I don't, which is interesting. I kind of weirdly wish I did, because I enjoy trolls for the most part. I don't feed them too much, but I do enjoy them.
You mean you go back at them?
Yeah, but I won't. I understand what their objective is, and their objective is essentially to smear whatever you're saying, however you're saying it, and to silence you, to effectively silence you. And so I'd been running my mouth for a very long time. My mother can attest to that since I was a child. So it'll be hard to silence me in anything. But also I do think it's important that we do look at how efficient this could be if it's not spoken out against.
And the chilling thing for me is to see that this is a state instrument. This is what the government is doing against its own citizens. And this gets to the point you were making at the beginning. What is going on here? What does this tell us about the direction our government's taking? What does it tell us about the health of our democracy?
It's scary times, and I was speaking with a former prosecutor from I forgot which district in New York, but just kind of direct messaging back and forth, and I was wondering where is our democracy? Is our democracy as healthy as we believe it is? Is it as healthy as we think it is, with the Trump administration kind of plowing over the Constitution and turning law into a mockery? The Mueller report, which very few people actually read, showed a number of illegalities, obstruction of justice, a lot of other potential crimes that Mueller kind of shot off to Congress and was like, hey, now the ball's in your court. And then people, after Mueller, after his press conference, then members of Congress began to come out and say, oh, well, these are grounds for impeachment. It's like, did you guys not read the report? Like Justin Amash read the report, Elizabeth Warren read the report, and they were some of the first ones to come out and say, hey, after reading this report, this guy needs to be impeached. And it's nothing political about it. And the hypocrisy is astounding. If you just imagine if Obama would have done half of the things that Donald Trump would have done, or that Donald Trump is currently doing, Republicans and GOP would have already tried to impeach him and would have tried to probably throw him in Guantanamo Bay.
They would have ground the government to a halt. There'd be no bills being passed. There'd be round-the-clock investigations. Every single committee would be investigating this.
Right.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the Benghazi experience was just a small taste of that.
Exactly.
You know, one of the least democratic elements of our society is how we set nuclear policy. You know, we don't have really a vote on this aside from who we elect. But there's no open discussion about this. A lot of the information is classified, and that's intensifying. The Congress is currently in a fight to try to get the administration to hand over, for example, some of the deals that they've been making with Saudi Arabia, just on transfer of civilian technology. Congress is in a bipartisan fight to try to get the department to hand this over. But on the big issues that you deal with, that we deal with here at Ploughshares Fund, number of weapons, strategy, targeting strategy, North Korea, Iran, not really enough public discussion about this. It's hard for citizens to get involved. To me, you're an example of a citizen who wants to be involved in this and is making your voice heard through your various platforms, publications, Twitter, appearances. If you could tell the President of the United States what to do, maybe not this one, but the next one, what are the kind of things you think we should be doing on nuclear policy? What should our nuclear policy look like?
Well, I would love to go back to the Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev conversations where they decided to eliminate nuclear weapons totally.
Yes.
And they were on the verge of that until the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, what they called, nicknamed Star Wars, Reagan's idea of a defense initiative that even till this day is it seems highly unlikely. And that was the only thing that was stopping the world from at least beginning the process to eliminate nuclear weapons. And as you know, the United States and Russia have more than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons.
You know, we should do a whole show on just that, what happened there in the Reykjavik summit. They came real close, and the transcripts show they started with eliminating a class of weapons, and then what about these weapons? What about the tactical weapons? George Shultz was in the room. He agrees, and pretty soon they're saying, let's get rid of all of them.
Yeah.
Every single one. We don't need them. And the holdup was Reagan insisting that he should be allowed to do SDI research for the next 10 years and start deploying the system. And Gorbachev said, no, you have to limit to the laboratory.
Right.
The laboratory.
Right.
And
for 10 years, yeah.
And Reagan wouldn't give in on that, and Gorbachev felt he couldn't give in. The problem is, if either one had given in, it would have been fine. Right. It would have worked, because the stuff didn't work. It was been in the laboratory anyway. Right. Gorbachev didn't have anything to fear. Reagan didn't have anything that was going to develop from this, and so we missed that moment. So you say, let's try to recapture that.
Let's try to. And with Donald Trump and his love fest with authoritarians, namely Vladimir Putin, why can't we get that done?
It's one of the hopes. It was one of the hopes we had of Trump.
Exactly.
There might be some, when a Republican makes a nuclear deal, he brings the party with him, he brings the Democrats with him. So this was a possibility that we hoped for, that at least he could do this, but no prospects.
No, it doesn't look like it. So I think
But get back to that in the next presidency.
Yeah, I hope so. And because it's important. It's something that really got me more involved in national security back in 2010. I was living in Miami before the season started. I was playing for the Baltimore Ravens, and I lived next to a port in Miami. And I remember watching on the Countdown to Zero, and they were discussing, and you obviously were also there, discussing the amount of uranium, enriched uranium that it would take to cause mass destruction in
a
city,
terrorist bomb, and how easy it was to get it through one of the cargo containers.
Exactly. And
it was me, Jeffrey Lewis, Matt Bunn, talking about how you can. They did some great graphics.
It was great. And by the way, if the listeners haven't seen it, it's a great documentary to go check out, Countdown to Zero. But in there, it discusses and it shows the size of a tennis ball, the uranium the size of a tennis ball, highly enriched uranium, the size of a tennis ball, into a shoebox. That shoebox with more shoeboxes, and then you put it in a container, and then the container goes on the ship with I don't know, dozens or hundreds of other containers, and then you talk about how do you trace that uranium, that radiation, and it's extremely hard to. And so that freaked me out because I lived right there, and I'm like, wait a minute, and I'm looking back at all these cargo ships with all these containers, and I'm just thinking, like, all it takes is the size of a tennis ball.
Oh, so you had a nice apartment overlooking the...
Yeah, but it made me...
I've seen those apartments from the street.
It made me terrified. It terrified me, and I wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn much more about it, and I think that got me started on the nuclear policy. And obviously, meeting you, and you invited me to a number of events. That's been awesome for me to learn. And I think we have to get back to that, because the average American doesn't understand. We all understand the power of nuclear weapons and how dangerous they are, but little things that have happened, like tactical nukes. We accidentally dropped a bomb in North Carolina that, thank God, I think 3 out of the 4 safety valves.
6 out of 7
failed. And the last one, I mean, can you imagine?
A tiny switch, a $2 switch didn't fail.
Jeez.
And that's why we still have North Carolina.
Right. and it's scary because you're looking at now this Chernobyl documentary that just came out, a miniseries, and it was just talking about, we all know that what happened in Chernobyl, but we're not, no one is immune to a nuclear disaster, because it can happen by accident, especially now with technology. I'm not big with computers, but obviously it doesn't take much. Systems fail all the time. There are things that happen that we're not ready for, that we can't account for, and then there's negligence coupled with a number of other things. So I think when you look at our nuclear policy, I think more American citizens should be aware of how dangerous and how close we are to maybe not having an all-out nuclear war, but all it takes is an accident or a misreading of someone else's intentions that can be seen as aggressive, but maybe it's defensive. And so there's that back and forth. So, until we get, I'm not sure if there's still the, a 15-minute notification where the president only has, from the time he can call in and
it's
get
less,
some nuclear
actually.
football.
We start our show off with a news segment called Early Warning, which is a 7-minute summary of the news. And we do 7 minutes because if the president is notified of a nuclear attack, that is the maximum amount of time he would have to decide whether to respond, whether he should press the button. And it could be as little as 5, it could be even 2 or 3 minutes. 7's the maximum, and you can't decide whether you're going to go out tonight in 7 minutes.
Have for dinner, yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Let alone end the world.
Yeah. And that's a dangerous thing in any person's hand, but especially this current president. So can you imagine in a room where it's Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Shanahan, which I don't know much about him, the defense secretary, but Bolton's going to be there. And Bolton's been there. Pompeo's going to be
Bolton
there.
convenes the call. The National Security Advisor convenes the call.
Right. And so what are we left with? Are we left with strategic thinkers? Are we left with deep thinkers? Or are we left with reactionary war hawks? And that's what we're left with. And so these policies are extremely dangerous. And one thing I appreciate about Elizabeth Warren is that she has at least acknowledged that the executive branch needs to roll back some of its powers, giving Congress back the war powers that they've abdicated, for the longest time now. I've appreciated that about her. And one thing I haven't really looked into, and I need to, is what her policy is on nuclear weapons, because I haven't heard her talk about it.
As a matter of fact, she did. She's got the clearest statement so far.
Of course she does.
She gave a speech at American University November 29th, and she devoted a good 4 or 5 paragraphs to her nuclear policy, which is basically no new weapons, no first use, and more arms control, not less. And that's the kind of policy that Adam Smith at the House Armed Services Committee has been articulating. And we've now seen Bernie Sanders speak out about this. That the real question, he said just a couple of days ago up in New Hampshire, was not what he was asked whether, as president, he could press the button. And he said, what kind of question is that?
Yeah.
He said the real question is, how do we get rid of these weapons?
Right. Thank you. Yes.
Joe Biden has spoken out on the stump in New Hampshire for no first use, saying we should have a no first use policy. But I wanted to ask you this anyway. When you're looking at the presidential campaigns developing, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What do you think the candidates are saying and what they should say?
The interesting thing with being here in D.C. for me and being here for almost 5 years, I've been able to meet a number of people, interesting folks in policy, interesting folks in government, and I've had the ability to speak with people who work for a number of presidential candidates, and so I've tried to get some background and some information, and maybe even prodding a little bit and asking, hey, what does this candidate think about? Because I haven't heard them speak on this. And so I'm glad you mentioned Elizabeth Warren. I want to go back and check that out, because I really do appreciate what she's attempting to do. And she's coming with a breath of fresh air. And I think that's what we need, especially coming from this administration. But, it's something that's not at the forefront, and I think it should be, because there is what's the opposition to nuclear weapons? Like, what are the opponents saying?
I mean, what's the opposition to reducing nuclear weapons?
Yeah, and I mean,
the guys who build the nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
And the officers who staff the nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
I mean, there really is a nuclear industrial complex.
Oh, for
and
sure.
There's about $55 billion a year we spend on nuclear weapons. That's a lot of lobbying, a lot of contracts, a lot of officer billets, a lot of jobs in states. That's what you're up against. I really believe this. Rather than an ideological debate, it's really about the money. It's really about the contracts. So that's why you say, well, who is really for more nuclear weapons?
Yeah, and like the opposition is just who you said it is. American citizens don't want to be subjected to a nuclear war. No one wants to be subjected to a nuclear war. So how do we cultivate this environment? How do we cultivate this atmosphere that Reagan and Gorbachev had, where we can get back to talking about eliminating nuclear weapons, more arms control, and no new weapons? Although Obama did sign a program where we were supposed to be spending $1 trillion over the next 30 years in new nuclear weapons. I don't know if that's still in effect or not.
Well, it's right. So it turns out, in order to get the New START treaty approved by the Senate, which he barely did at the end of 2010, he had to pay a ransom for it. And he had to assure some of the senators, particularly those that had nuclear weapons in their states, that he would support the so-called modernization, meaning let's go keep building these and let's build new ones. He made that deal. I think Obama never thought that we're going to spend that much on them because he was hoping to follow up New START with a real arms control deal that would have cut the forces by a third, so the money would have been affordable. What's happened is there has been no arms control since then, but the contracts have continued and grown. So this relatively modest modernization, they were tracking it at about $88 billion at that time, is now grown to $1.7 trillion. And we're on the hook for a whole new generation of weapons.
And that's disturbing because you look at our infrastructure, our education. I believe we're 24th and 32nd in math and science, and that's on a decline year in and year out. There are a number of issues that we have that nuclear weapons cannot solve.
You can't travel down a street in America. You can't cross a bridge in America and not understand that we got some serious infrastructure issues. You can't walk into a school and say, man, we got to be spending more money on these kids.
Right.
But we're not.
We're not. And so where does that lead us to? What are we left with? A great nuclear weapons system, but our kids aren't learning. Kids in college, they have no incentive to go to college anymore because you're coming out on the other end and tens and dozens of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and then you have to work a job, mostly at minimum wage. That most of your money is going to go to paying off these loans and these predatory loans, and so it's we are in perilous times, and it's not just because of Donald Trump. This is a system that has been in place long before Donald Trump got here. And it has not gotten much better up to today. But hopefully, like I said, you're looking at some of these new candidates, and hopefully they can come in and change a lot of these policies. Change doesn't happen in one presidential election or a couple, but over time you continue to lay the foundation. And it's essentially what you said with Reagan and Gorbachev, how they essentially started small with nuclear weapons, and then by the end of it, they were like, "Hey, wait a minute, we can do this. We can get rid of nuclear weapons.
We don't need any of them."
And so that's what we have to do.
Let's close here with something positive about Trump. It's hard. Is there any part of his nuclear policies, his nuclear strategy that you would agree with? We were talking about some of this over lunch at Joe's Crab House the other day.
Yeah, we were. I think I have been, even though it's for his own egotistical, personal reasons, but I have been open to him speaking with Kim Jong-un. I think it's much better than fire and fury. I think it's much better than him saying that North Korea will no longer exist if they make any more threats to the United States. North Korea has made threats over the many years, and the United States has done the same. That's probably the best thing I can say is that I'm much more appreciative of him keeping North Korea at bay with writing love letters to Kim Jong-un. I'm okay with that. I would much rather have that than bombastic rhetoric and speaking about bombing each other and Hawaii getting these fake signals or unintentional false alarms, not fake, unintentional false alarms, and people are freaking out because of the heightened sense of war between the United States and North Korea. But
I was in Colorado in Boulder back in April, and I heard Amy Klobuchar, also a candidate, saying that she would support the diplomatic engagement with North Korea. She says that's one thing that Trump's done right, but she would have real diplomatic engagement, backed up with a full team at the State Department, right? So that's what you're saying.
Yeah, do we even have, even to this day, I know when we first started the negotiations, when Trump first started the negotiations with Kim with the summit, did we even have an ambassador to South Korea at the time?
No.
Do we have an ambassador to South Korea currently?
We do. We named one a few months ago.
Okay, and so
a former commander of the Korean Command.
Yeah. So
Harry Harris.
So Trump's situation with North Korea has just essentially been, I'm going to butter up Kim Jong-un and you guys do all the work. Well, who's you guys? John Bolton? John Bolton told North Korea.
That's exactly
you know what I
right.
mean?
And then he turns to John Bolton and
Yeah.
says, "Well, they have to completely surrender. Here, sign the surrender
Mike
document."
Pompeo. I mean, John Bolton in his book said that he told the North Koreans after the invasion of Iraq, he told the North Koreans to, quote, learn the appropriate lesson from us invading Iraq for WMD purposes. And they did. 3 years later, they detonated a nuclear bomb. And this guy is still, he's back. He's like,
That's
he's
exactly
like whack-a-mole.
right.
He gets sacked and he comes right back for more.
I'd forgotten about this quote. He was asked early on when things were looking good in Iraq, like 2003, 2004, what lesson North Korea and Iran should take from the invasion of Iraq. And he said, take a number. Ooh, and that was tough talk, but that's what he believes. As he's a serial regime changer. That's what he believes.
And like I said, in a normal society, this guy would even be ashamed to be out in public. And it's scary because he as a national security advisor, Trump. This is who Trump is turning to, a man who has explicitly talked about bombing North Korea, talked about bombing Iran. He would bomb anywhere, and that's the scary thing, is that this is the person that Trump is turning to. If Trump had actual diplomats in office and people who were really concerned, not just from a war between America and North Korea, but we have South Koreans, we have Guam there, and then you're talking about nuclear war. There's Japan, China, Russia. There's more people that are involved than just Americans.
Yeah.
And you had Bolton basically saying to the effect of, well, if there is a war, it'll be over there. We don't want a war to be here. And it's like, yeah, well, if a war is, quote, over there, then, you have South Korea, you have Russia, you have China, Japan, you have American citizens in all these places, and you have them in Guam and on the island right there. So what are we really talking about? Like, what are we really doing? Yeah. And there is no conversation that John Bolton wants to have that is anything less than complete and utter surrender for the North Korean regime. And we know through history, as the North Koreans have said throughout time over and over again, that they have learned lessons from what John Bolton said. They learned lessons from Syria. They've learned lessons from Iraq. They've learned lessons from Libya, where you don't give up your nuclear weapons. That's the only deterrent from the United States invasion. And every country, Iraq and Libya, the countries that have worked deals out with the West and that did not have nuclear weapons, they were the ones who were invaded. And North Korean diplomats and officials have explicitly said this on a number of occasions.
We have to bring this to an end, but not because I want to. We're just out of time. This was everything I'd hoped, Donté. It's great to have you come in, and thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was my honor.
And thank you for being my friend. It's a real pleasure, man.
You're my man, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Megan McCall. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Theme music is by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit Ploughshares.org.